All right, thank you all for joining us here this evening for yet another webinar related to the Redwood Life Precise Planet EIR project. Tonight we're here to give an overview of the sensitivity analyses. My name is Dave Jarvis from Planet Place, part of the consulting team, many of which are here today, who you'll hear from. But before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jeff to do a welcome. Over to you, Jeff.
Good evening, everyone. Jeff Schwab, Redwood City Community Development Director here. I'm joined tonight by Project Planner Margaret Netto and Ryan Kuchnig from the city, as well as folks from our consulting team, Ramey and Associates and their sub-consultants, Plan to Place, David J. Powers, Schaff and Wheeler, and Hexagon Transportation. And they're going to go through some initial analysis that has been done called the sensitivity analysis for the Redwood Life site. And I will let them go through that presentation, and then we'll be available to answer questions at the end. And Dave is going to explain, and Troy, how that process will work. So thank you all for joining.
Great, thank you, Jeff. If we go to the next slide, Troy. So if you haven't joined us for one of these webinars to date, the way that we're doing it is asking that you go ahead and pose any questions or comments you might have through the Q&A function, and you could do that throughout the duration of the presentations. Those that are process related, we'll go ahead and answer directly in the Q&A function if we can. Others that are related to topics that are being presented, we'll go ahead and actually answer those after all of the presentations so that we can go through all of them together. And then those that we can't answer because we don't have an answer to them, or they're maybe not topic related, we will cover as part of the summary after the webinar itself. So thank you all again for joining us and your patience to get through the presentations before we get to that Q&A, which is really important and a critical reason why we're here today. So before we get started, if we go to the next slide, we also typically like to do a live poll, and that's just to get a sense of who is in the room with us. Basic demographics, I'm going to launch that now. And this is, again, just to get an understanding of who's joining us, how you're connected to the Redwood Shores area, if you've been involved in this process before, and then some basic demographic questions that we always like to ask. As we go out and reach the community, we want to make sure that we're getting multiple perspectives included as part of this process. So this gives us an opportunity to gauge how well we're doing by taking these polls throughout the meeting. And then there is also a question at the end of this poll that just is asking which topic you might be most interested in here this evening, just to give us a pulse. As we get into the presentations, you could pick all of the topics or just one or two, but that'll also help us kind of gain a pulse of why you joined us tonight and what's most interesting to you. So I'm going to let that go for maybe another 30 seconds here. So, excuse me, I see about half the folks in the room have taken it so far. Maybe we'll give it another 30 seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and end the poll in a few seconds here, and then I'll share the results with you all so you can take a quick look. And these results will also all be included in the summary that we're going to put together after this meeting. So let me see, maybe another 10 seconds here. And no problem at all if you didn't get a chance to participate now. We'll have a chance to do that again later if you'd like. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. Looks like we got a vast majority of folks that have taken it. So I'm going to end it now, and then I'm going to share those results back out to you. And as the results pop up on the screen, there's a bar on the right side so that you can scroll through all of the answers on your own. And again, if you don't get a chance to go through them all now, they will all be included in the summary after the meeting. So yeah, as you can see, as expected, majority of folks live in Redwood Shores and or in the city and or visit the area. Looks like about a third of you have been to many meetings in the past. Half have been to at least a meeting. Yeah, so this is really interesting. And in terms of the topics, it looks like vast majority are really interested in the environmental analysis, followed by the transportation or traffic analysis and utilities. So that's all great information for us to have. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now and ask Troy to go to the next slide. So yeah, as Jeff mentioned in the welcome that we've already done, we're going to start with a background presentation, which Troy is going to give here in a minute, just to provide some context, maybe for those that haven't been part of these presentations in the past, to give you a sense of what the precise plan is, and then some context around the analyses that have been done. And then again, as Jeff mentioned, we have three presenters here with us today from the various consultant team to provide an overview of the environmental analysis, the transportation analysis, and one on utility. So really excited to hear from them. And then again, most importantly, gather your questions and comments and have a discussion at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Troy to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Good to see you all here tonight. So as Dave said, I'll give a very brief refresher on the city-led precise plan and the EIR process. Then I'll go ahead and turn it over to our panelists, who will each in turn give an overview of their technical findings on the key topics. And then I'll hand it back to Dave, who will facilitate a group question and answer session regarding these findings. So as I did on our past Redwood Life webinars, I'll start with a brief overview of our precise plan and EIR process in terms of where we stand, where we are, and what's coming next. I'll then introduce tonight's topic, which is the sensitivity analysis results. So as most of us know, in 2023, City Council, in response to concerns raised by this community and others, the council initiated a planning and environmental impact review process, which was really centered around community engagement led by the city, including this webinar and the various in-person workshops that have been held and will be held at the library. This process focuses really on the creation of a compromise alternative, which will be studied at an equal level in CEQA as the proposed Longfellow project. City is also undertaking a very thorough analysis of the proposed community benefits and the fiscal impacts of both the proposed project and the compromise alternative that will be selected with input from this community. And to reiterate, this is a city-led process and not an applicant-led process that will ultimately result in planning and CEQA documents that will govern any future redevelopment of this site. The site hosts approximately 20 two-story buildings with 25 tenants, just under 1 million square feet of R&D and life sciences uses. Approximately 1,500 employees are on site on any given day. At full occupancy, this would be closer to 4,000 employees could be potentially accommodated. This slide gives an overview of some of our upcoming engagement activities. We've posted these events in the pilot and also sent emails and blasts about these. Feel free to visit our website to sign up for our email list if you haven't gotten those. Our next engagement event is another webinar focused, the third and final in our series, focused on life sciences, scheduled for next Thursday, February the 4th. The next in-person event we're excited to announce is the community workshop on Wednesday, February 12th. Again, that will be held at the Redwood Shores Library. We'll be presenting and discussing the potential CEQA project alternatives. A workshop will be accompanied by an online survey publicly available to anyone to take and to provide your feedback and reactions to those potential alternatives. Finally, we'll be giving an update to the City Council and the Planning Commission on the evening of Tuesday, March 4th. So just quickly, I'll give a reminder about the proposed Longfellow project, which was analyzed by our various technical team members. The proposed Longfellow development project proposes to replace the existing 20 buildings on site with 15 new buildings. This proposal would remove nearly all of the existing surface parking, allowing for approximately 30 acres of new public open spaces, greenways, and other landscaping. This proposal would increase the number of parking spaces to approximately 7,000. The proposed project has requested a net increase of around 2.3 million square feet, which would result in a total of approximately 3.3 million square feet. Would include a hotel and a public amenity building. The floor area ratio would be increased from 0.3 up to 0.95. Proposed buildings would be between 4 and 6 stories tall, or between 80 and 100 feet tall. Project would be phased over 25 years, and its full build out would accommodate somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 employees. So now I'll quickly just lay out what our team members did and did not do as part of this initial work, so we're all on the same page. So what did our experts in CEQA at David Powers do? They initially described the existing conditions on the site from an environmental standpoint. They identified the key issues that will require additional analysis and more study in the upcoming EIR work. Included a new biological resources study, among others, as well as peer reviews of the applicant's geotechnical and environmental sensitivity analysis reports. Please note that at any time you can use this QR code to jump to the published technical reports, of which are available on the project website. So I encourage you to read those if you haven't already. What did our traffic and utility team members cover? They both completed preliminary assessments of respectively the traffic and utility impacts of the proposed project in comparison to two what we call no project scenarios. One which is where the site remains as it is today, the current conditions, and the other which anticipates a full build out of the existing Westport specific plan. And let's please pay careful attention to this slide. We just want to reiterate that our analysis is not a full completed CEQA analysis with all of the relevant and required impact findings and mitigations. Nor does our work at this time answer all of the excellent questions that have been raised by this community. And so we just want to be clear that this work is the beginning of our process and not the end. We will be doing more work on these topics. And just to tee up our guests, I'll provide a quick summary of their findings at a high level. On the environmental side, the critical topics that will be the focus of additional analysis are air quality, biology, geology, soils, hazardous materials, noise, and hydrology. From a traffic standpoint, Hexagon found no adverse impacts to vehicle miles traveled, which is to say that the proposed project performs better or more efficiently on a per capita basis compared to current conditions from a vehicle miles travel standpoint. The preliminary analysis also found that cumulative regional growth is so substantial that before the project is even considered, many nearby intersections have significant delays in the future. However, the project would worsen some of these intersections, as Michelle will discuss. Regarding utilities, the system that it would be potentially the most impacted by this proposed development is the sanitary sewer system. Several pumps and force mains are not expected to be adequate in their current condition to handle the volumes that would be generated by the project. Similarly, the sewer treatment plant would need greater capacity to service the project. And Leif will discuss that in more detail. And so now on to our panelists. We'll begin with Christy from David J. Powers, followed by Michelle Hunt of Hexagon, and finally Leif Component of Schaffen Wheeler. Christy?
Hi, thank you, Troy. Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Weiss. I am a principal project manager at David J. Powers and Associates. Our firm has been hired by the city to prepare an environmental sensitivity analysis for the project site and assist the city in completing the environmental review for the project under the California Environmental Quality Act, or otherwise known as CEQA. Before I jump into my presentation slides about the sensitivity analysis, I'll quickly go over what is CEQA. Next slide, please, Troy. The purpose of CEQA is to provide information to decision makers and the public regarding impacts of proposed projects. It's also to identify ways to mitigate or avoid those impacts and identify and evaluate alternatives to the proposed project. The proposed Longfellow development project is subject to CEQA, as well as the city-led precise plan alternative. The city is currently in the early stages of the environmental review for the project site, which the sensitivity analysis is part of. However, as mentioned by Troy earlier, the sensitivity analysis is not the formal CEQA analysis. Next slide. So what is the sensitivity analysis? The purpose of the sensitivity analysis is to provide an overview of the existing physical conditions and identify any known issues that will need to be considered or addressed during the planning process and environmental review for the future development of the site. It will also be used by a city staff to help create the alternative to the proposed Longfellow project. This analysis, like Troy mentioned, is not a formal CEQA document and does not make any CEQA impact determinations, conclusions, or include any formal mitigation measures. Rather, the information in the sensitivity analysis will be used and built upon in the CEQA document. Next slide. So this one's about the format of the sensitivity analysis. So if you haven't looked at it yet, the initial sections of the sensitivity analysis provide an executive summary, a purpose, and description of the site's location and existing development conditions, as well as a brief description of the proposed Longfellow project, which is also known as Redwood Life Evolve. The bulk of the report is in section 4, where the environmental conditions, considerations, and constraints are described. The analysis in this section 4 is based on site visits, technical reports, including peer reviews, and preliminary technical modeling, and the professional opinions of the city's environmental consultants and technical consultants. The resource areas discussed in section 4 are those anticipated to be addressed in the CEQA analysis. Next slide. Here's a list of all of the environmental resource areas addressed in section 4 of the sensitivity analysis. The ones in bold on this slide are the ones we anticipate are the key environmental resource areas. One thing to note is that there's only a brief discussion of traffic and utilities in the sensitivity analysis, and this is because there are separate reports that were prepared for these topics that can be found on the project website. These topics will be discussed by the city's transportation and utility consultants following my presentation. So in the slides that follow, I'll provide an overview of the existing conditions, considerations, and constraints for the bolded topics, except for transportation and utilities, which Leif and Michelle will be presenting after me. The actual sensitivity analysis includes a discussion of all these resource areas and in much more detail than I'll go over in my presentation. Next slide. All right, the first environmental resource area is aesthetics. So the existing conditions for aesthetics and all the other resource areas is really important because the existing conditions are typically the baseline for impact analyses under CEQA. So for aesthetics, the existing conditions describes how the project is generally flat and located in an urban area of Redwood City and bordered by Belmont Slough to the north and west and residential development to the east and south. The project site is designated as commercial office professional technology in the city's general plan, which is also important to note because the general plan is the city's vision that guides the growth and development for the whole city. The site is zoned commercial park and is subject to the Westport specific plan. And the figure on this slide is an aerial shot of the site. Next slide. So for each environmental resource area, the considerations and constraints focus on the areas that could be impacts under CEQA and are primarily about the site and the future development of the site, whether it be the Longfellow project or the city's alternative precise plan. So the constraints we identified include the land use and building heights proposed by Longfellow development. And we found those to be consistent with what's allowed under the existing general plan and zoning designations. Future development on site, including the design of the buildings, would be subject to the city's Architectural Advisory Committee recommendations and Planning Commission approval. The proposed Longfellow project would result in redevelopment of the site with larger buildings of greater intensity compared to existing conditions, which could result in increased light or glare effects. Next slide. Okay, air quality. The existing conditions for air quality, we found the primary source of air emissions on site under existing conditions are from vehicles traveling to and from the project site. Other emissions include those associated with the former landfill that used to operate on site. Any air pollutant emissions or odors associated with the former landfill are part of the baseline or existing conditions and are not considered to be substantially affected by the redevelopment of the site. While there's no sensitive receptors on site, there are definitely nearby residents southeast of the project site along Port Walk Place, Cork Harbor Circle, and Boardwalk Place. There's also several daycares, preschools, elementary schools, high schools, and parks in proximity to the site. For considerations and constraints, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is the agency primarily responsible for assuring that federal and state ambient air quality standards are maintained. And they have set emission thresholds to determine whether development projects would have any impacts. The build out of the proposed Longfellow project would result in temporary construction period emissions, including those from construction equipment and operational period emissions. Operational period emissions include those from vehicles driven to and from the project site, and any potential stationary sources such as emergency generators, as well as architectural coatings, which primarily consist of exterior paint. So we completed preliminary modeling, and the results show that the proposed Longfellow project could result in significant construction and operational air pollutant emissions. More refined project-specific analysis would be required to provide a more accurate estimation of the pollutant emissions and determine whether measures would need to be implemented to reduce those emissions. In addition, future analysis will consider if there's a period of times where phases of construction would overlap with operations to determine if there's any impacts resulting from overlapping construction and operational emissions. Construction and operation of the Longfellow project has the potential to also release toxic air contaminants, or TACs, that could lead to increased health risks to nearby sensitive receptors. And this is typical of construction and operation projects. The primary source of TACs would be construction emissions. However, project-generated traffic and stationary sources would also contribute. In addition, local sources of TAC emissions, such as local roadways and other permitted stationary sources in the area, would also need to be considered as part of the CEQA analysis. Projects can also generate significant odor impacts depending on several variables, including the source of odor, frequency, intensity, distance to sensitive receptors, and wind direction. The odors generated by construction and operations would be considered as part of the EIR process. Next slide. Okay, biological resources. There are 4 habitat types on site. We had our biologists go out there, and the 4 habitat types are developed land, tidal salt marsh, diked bracking marsh, and levee slope. Within these habitats, there's one special status plant species determined to be feasibly occurring on site, which is the Congdon's tar plant. Congdon's tar plant could occur on the levee slope and tidal salt marsh habitat. There's several special status animal species that could also occur on site, including the California Ridgway's rail, California black rail, western snowy plover, California least tern, the salt marsh harvest mouse, and the salt marsh wandering shrew. The special status marine species that could occur on site or nearby include the include the longfin smelt, Central California coast steelhead, and southern green sturgeon. So the constraints for the site, next slide, Troy. Thank you. The constraints include impacts to these special status species that could be present on site, and we'll they'll be evaluated in the EIR, and we anticipate that pre-construction surveys for all these special status species would be necessary to confirm their presence or absence. And if found, mitigation measures and compensation would be done in accordance with existing regulations. If future development results in impacts to jurisdictional waters, such as Belmont Slough, or the levee slope or riparian habitat, which are regulated by agencies including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, or the BCDC, mitigation and permits from the appropriate agency would be required. And the map on this slide just shows the different jurisdictional waters. Future development on site could include buildings with glass windows and nighttime lighting. Therefore, the potential for bird collisions with proposed development will need to be evaluated in the CEQA document as well. Future development could also result in the removal of existing trees from the project site. Therefore, compliance with the city's tree preservation ordinance will also be evaluated. Next slide. The next one's about energy. So the project site currently uses electricity and natural gas for building functions such as lighting and the heating and cooling system. It's assumed that the existing life science uses also use natural gas as part of their operations. And gasoline is consumed by vehicles of employees and visitors traveling to and from the project site. The constraints for energy, they include the fact that Longfellow would include similar uses that would use energy just like existing conditions on site, but they'd have different land uses, including community amenity center and a hotel that would have energy demand. The energy primarily in the form of electricity would be used for heating and cooling, lighting, appliances, electronics, and water heating, just like existing conditions. But based on current plans that we reviewed for Longfellow's project, the proposed buildings would be 100% electric. They would be built to LEED Gold standards and include solar panels on most of the buildings. Vehicles from employees and visitors would continue to consume gasoline as well. The proposed development on site would be evaluated for compliance with existing regulations, including Cal Green and Title 24. Next slide, please. Geology and soils. Okay, for the existing conditions, we describe how the site's located within the San Francisco Bay Area, which is one of the most seismically active areas in the United States. Therefore, ground shaking at the project site, as well as all of the Bay Area, is predicted to be strong to very strong during a seismic event. Additionally, the project site is located within a designated liquefaction hazard zone. The project site is originally covered in wetlands until about the mid-1940s when it was filled and graded. The project site is underlain by two general subsurface conditions. The eastern half of the site is underlain by a former landfill, while the western half is underlain by fill. Both sites ultimately sit atop Young Bay mud. Given that the site is underlain by fill, a former landfill, and Young Bay mud, building foundations on the project site are susceptible to settlement. The site has a low risk for lateral spreading because of the underlying soil conditions along the slough, and likely has low to no risk for landslide given the relatively flat nature of the site. Pursuant to existing regulations, including the California Building Code, development on site would be required to prepare a design-level geotechnical investigation to address seismic and seismic-related hazards. Another geology and soil consideration is the potential to encounter paleontological resources, including fossils. Since the site is underlain by fill and Young Bay mud with bedrock starting at 40 or more feet below ground surface, the potential to encounter paleontological resources is considered low. Next slide. Greenhouse gas emissions. In general, greenhouse gas, or GHGs, are gases that trap heat in the atmosphere and regulate the Earth's temperature. The project site currently generates GHG emissions from vehicle trips, on-site emergency generators, and landfill events. The project site also generates indirect greenhouse gas emissions from electricity and natural gas use. The city has adopted a 2030 climate action plan, which is a qualified plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the city. The climate action plan is a tool available to cities that allows them to plan and demonstrate that development in the city as a whole would not result in significant greenhouse gas emissions as long as they're consistent with the policies in that plan. For considerations and constraints, the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions from the project would be similar to the sources under existing conditions. So vehicle trips, emergency generators, electricity use, and things like that. The Longfellow project includes installation of solar panels on most of the buildings, which would reduce indirect greenhouse gas emissions from electricity use. In addition, it's anticipated the development of the project site would obtain power from Peninsula Clean Energy, which by default provides 75% carbon-free electricity and has an option for customers to receive 100% carbon-free electricity. Future development on site would be evaluated against greenhouse gas significance thresholds and evaluated with for consistency with plans and policies adopted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. For hazards and hazardous materials, the existing conditions describes how the project site was originally a wetland in the margins of San Francisco Bay. In the early 1900s, the site was dredged and used as pasture land until it was converted to the Westport landfill in the mid-1900s. The landfill was closed in 1970, and a cap and fill were placed over the site prior to redevelopment of the site with the current uses in the late 1990s. The previous Westport landfill on site is a recognized environmental condition, or REC, because of groundwater and leachate contamination and methane gas intrusion on site. No other RECs or RECs are identified on site or off site. The project site is subject to compliance with existing regulations governing the maintenance of the landfill cap, landfill gas venting and monitoring system, leachate collection system on site, as well as land use approval. The existing life science uses on site consist of biosafety level 1 and 2. These facilities work with agents that present minimal to moderate hazards to personnel and the environment. The project site is located approximately 1.5 miles north of the San Carlos Airport. There's one local school within 1/4 mile of the site, which is Design Tech High School, located approximately 1,000 feet west of the project site. So here on this figure, you'll just see the boundaries outlined for the extent of the landfill cap in green, and the project site is the red boundary, and the orange boundary is the estimated extent of the refuse on site. Next slide, please. For constraints, hazardous materials impacts could occur during construction activities on site. Redevelopment of the site will be evaluated for compliance with existing regulations, and any necessary measures will be identified to avoid or reduce impacts from transportation, use, and disposal of hazardous materials during construction and operation of future uses. Given the previous landfill on site, future redevelopment would likely be required to implement measures to reduce potential impacts to the public, including construction workers and nearby residents, and the environment from hazardous materials, such as preparation and implementation of safety plans, a site management plan, and installation of vapor intrusion monitoring systems. Future development would also be subject to compliance with existing regulations governing the maintenance of the landfill cap and other landfill-related operations, the post-closure ones. The Longfellow project could include the operation of biosafety level 3 facilities. Biosafety level 3 facilities are not currently operating on site. And this type of facility works with agents that may cause serious or potentially lethal diseases through inhalation. The CDC provides overarching guidance on biosafety practices. It's assumed that future uses will comply with all regulations governing the transport, storage, and study of hazardous agents, and implement additional design and engineering features including those suggested by the CDC for biosafety level 3 facilities. The project site is sufficient distance from the San Carlos Airport and is not within any of its safety zones. The project building heights would need to comply with FAA requirements. Any conflicts with adopted emergency response plans or emergency evacuation plans will also be evaluated in the CEQA document. Next slide, please. For hydrology and water quality, we disclose that the project site is not located within a 100-year floodplain. According to FEMA, the project site is located within flood zone X. The project site is currently not subject to sea level rise flooding. However, sea level rise projections show that the western and southern portions of the site could become flooded due to a 1 foot increase in sea levels estimated in 2050. The project site is currently 65% or 54.7 acres impervious and 35% impervious, 65% impervious and 35% pervious. Stormwater on site is currently collected via pipes and inlets and conveyed to existing storm drain lines within Bridge Parkway and Marine Parkway. For constraints, redevelopment of the site could alter the site's existing drainage and disturb the soil and with the replacement of paving and new development. This could result in soil erosion and affect runoff water quality during construction and operation. The proposed Longfellow project includes design features to reduce flooding risk on site due to sea level rise, such as raising the entire grade of the project site and the levee along Belmont Slough. The project site contains groundwater monitoring wells in relation to the underlying landfill and monitoring requirements. The need for dewatering during future construction and operations will need to be addressed and evaluated in the CEQA document to ensure that contaminated water is not discharged into the environment. The redevelopment of the site would also need to comply with existing regulations to reduce water quality and site drainage impacts. Next slide. The next one's for noise. So 4 long-term and 8 short-term noise measurements were taken at various locations on the project site. And this aerial map identifies those. And the noise measurements were taken on the project site and within the adjacent residential neighborhoods southeast of the project site and west of the project site across Belmont Slough. The long and short-term noise measurements show that the project site is fairly quiet. Next slide. For considerations and constraints, future construction on site would likely increase ambient noise levels in the project area. To reduce potential construction noise impacting nearby residents, best management practices for construction noise control, and potentially temporary noise barriers during the noisier phases of construction may be required. Most construction activities required to build the Longfellow project are not expected to produce substantial vibration levels at nearby sensitive receptors. However, the project will likely require pile driving for foundations. Pile driving generates high levels of vibration and could affect nearby residents. Measures to reduce construction vibration impacts. Sorry, hold on one second. Sorry about that. I'm not used to talking for so long. Okay, so we left off on pile driving. So pile driving can generate high levels of vibration that could affect nearby receptors. So we anticipate best management practice and possibly mitigation measures will need to be identified to reduce those impacts so that structural damage is not caused to adjacent buildings. Operational noise from future development on site, including project-generated traffic and mechanical equipment, will need to be evaluated as well in the EIR, along with any potential noise from overlapping construction and operational noise. Next slide, please. Okay, public services. The project site is served by the Redwood City Police Department, or RCPD. and the Redwood City Fire Department, or RDFD. The nearest fire station to the project site is station number 20, which is approximately 0.9 miles east of the site on Redwood Shores Parkway. The project site is located within the Belmont Redwood Shores School District and Sequoia Union High School District. The closest school to the project site, as I mentioned before, is the Design Tech High School, located approximately 1,000 feet west of the project site. The nearest park is Shorebird Park, directly east of the project site across Marine Parkway. The nearest library is Redwood Shores Branch Library, located directly south of the project site. For constraints, we talk about how the project site is already served by police and fire and won't require the expansion of the existing service area for those agencies. The general plan identifies police and fire response time goals of 5 minutes. The proposed Longfellow development project would redevelop the site with similar uses to existing conditions, but at a greater intensity. This increase in intensity could result in an increase in demand for police and fire services compared to existing conditions. Coordination with the fire department and police department would be completed to confirm adequacy of existing facilities and determine whether additional police or fire facilities would be required to serve the project. The proposed Longfellow development project doesn't include any residential units. Therefore, it wouldn't directly add students to the local school districts, and there would be no direct impact. The proposed Longfellow development project would be required to pay the applicable school impact fee set by the school district to minimize indirect impacts. The city has a goal of maintaining 3 acres of park space per 1,000 residents. Since the Longfellow project doesn't include new residential units, the city's parkland space goal is not applicable to the project. In addition, the proposed Longfellow development includes 47 acres of green space on site to serve the recreational needs of the tenants. Although the general plan does not identify a service goal for library services, increased demand for library services is typically generated by residents. And as I mentioned for schools and parks, the Longfellow development project does not generate any residents on site. All right, my last slide, and then I'm going to have my water break. Okay, thank you for being so patient. As I mentioned at the beginning, the sensitivity analysis will be used by city staff to help create a project alternative to the Longfellow development project. Once the alternative is created, environmental review pursuant to CEQA will be completed for both the proposed Longfellow project as well as the city alternative. It's anticipated that an environmental impact report, or EIR, will be prepared for the Longfellow development project and the project alternative. The EIR analysis will build on the information and technical reports included in the sensitivity analysis and include more detailed project-specific technical analysis of impacts and identify mitigations to reduce any significant impacts. I also want to emphasize that the EIR will evaluate the proposed Longfellow development project and city alternative in the same level of detail in the EIR. On the right of the slide are the steps in the EIR process, beginning with the notice of preparation at the top left, which will be prepared once the project alternative is created. The orange highlighted steps are where opportunities for public involvement are solicited. The notice of preparation is a notice published by the city stating that an EIR will be prepared for the project and solicit feedback on the scope of the environmental review. The next step is where the city will host a public scoping meeting to provide another opportunity for the public to provide feedback on the scope and content of the EIR. This feedback will be taken into account and addressed accordingly in the EIR. When all the analysis and consideration of the feedback is complete, the draft EIR, along with the notice of availability, will be released and circulated for a 45-day public comment review period. Once the city carefully reviews all the comments, the city will prepare a final EIR, which will include responses to the environmental concerns raised in the comment letters and any text revisions to the draft EIR. Once the final EIR is complete, the city will have a hearing to certify the EIR. The decision to certify the EIR is separate from the decision to approve the project, though these decisions can be made at the same hearing. If the EIR is certified and the project is approved, the city will file a notice of determination. The city will have a notification for each of these steps when they occur. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle to talk about transportation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. My name is Michelle Hunt. I'm a Vice President and Principal Associate with Hexagon Transportation Consultants, and we have been hired as part of the Ramey team working for the city of Redwood City to evaluate this project's effects on transportation. So my job is quite a bit easier than Christy's because I'm only going to focus on one topic area, which is transportation. So next slide. So the transportation analysis was conducted in order to identify any constraints or issues that could be caused related to transportation, to also help inform the selection of the alternatives. And much of the work that we've done and completed as part of the sensitivity analysis will be carried forward and included in the CEQA document that will be prepared along with some additional analysis. So next slide. So the sensitivity analysis that we've conducted has three main sections. First, we evaluated vehicle miles traveled. We use the VMT acronym throughout our report, just as a shortcut. That is the primary quantitative measure for evaluating transportation impacts under CEQA. We also evaluated intersection level of service, and then we looked at peak spreading. And so I'm going to talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. Next slide. So VMT, again, this is vehicle miles traveled. So this is a total network-wide measure of the total distance traveled by motor vehicles within a certain area or vehicle trips generated by a specific project. So in this example, if there is a resident who goes from home to work, travels 10 miles, and then on their way back, they stop at a store, and then they go back home, that's 20 miles of travel there. So the VMT would be 20. It's that simple. So next slide. The VMT findings will be included in the CEQA document. But first of all, the VMT is evaluated not as a total measure, but per job. So this is the amount of travel in miles per job that would be for the project. So it's compared to the baseline average VMT per job for San Mateo County, which is 21.35 miles for each job in San Mateo County. The impact threshold that the city of Redwood City has set is 15% below the existing countywide average. So that would be 18.15 miles per job. So for the project right now under existing conditions, we calculate that there is an average of 17.34 miles per job, and this is a daily measure, 17.34 miles per day for each employee who is working at the site. In the future, in the year 2050, without the project, that would increase, and that is because that 2050 scenario reflects the intensification that could occur under the Westport specific plan. So that is 18.57 miles per job. And then with the project, the VMT is projected to decrease to 17.74. So that would be below the threshold of 18.15. The primary reasons why the VMT per job is lower with the project are threefold. First of all, the transit and carpool mode shares are projected to increase in the future just due to the density of the area increasing. Secondly, there would be fewer trips per job because of the type of land use with the life science designation compared to the office use that would be permitted under the Westport specific plan. And then thirdly, there would be more internal trips because of the inclusion of some retail jobs in the project, including a hotel. So that allows some trips to be contained within the site. And so that also helps to reduce the VMT. Next slide. So intersection level of service is a rating system to describe the quality of traffic flow at a specific location based on driver's experience. So compared to VMT, which was a network-wide measure, this is location specific. So we're talking about the performance of a specific intersection. So we use letter grades just like you got in school from A to F, right? A means little or no traffic delay, and F is extreme traffic delay. Those letter grades are handed out based on the amount of delay that a vehicle experiences going through that intersection on average. The city of Redwood City is set a standard of level service D that applies everywhere except the downtown area. Next slide. So our study scenarios for the sensitivity analysis were limited just to existing conditions, and then we looked at cumulative conditions which reflect the year 2050. So we have the year 2050 no project conditions, which includes traffic from other future growth in the Redwood Shores area and through the region in general. And that is based on land use projections that are provided by the City and County Association of Governments of San Mateo County. That's CCAG is their acronym. So, and then the last scenario is the cumulative plus project. So it is the same, except instead of the office use that would be permitted under the Westport specific plan, now we are substituting the proposed project. Next slide. So for level of service analysis, we have looked at 20 intersections that are expected to be potentially affected by this project. They're primarily in Redwood Shores, although there are some intersections along the Ralston Avenue corridor within Belmont. Next slide. So this gives an indication of sort of the range of level of service under each of the scenarios. So under existing conditions, you see we have all of the intersections are operating at level of service D or better. So A is green, the blue is B, gray is C, and D is yellow. So we're all at all 20 intersections are at level service D or better, so they're all within the city's desired level service standard. In cumulative conditions, though, even without the project, but with the projected increase in uses elsewhere, and just with the increase in traffic that could be generated by the office use on site, we see a degradation in the intersection level service, and now we have some intersections that have degraded to level service E, which is the light orange, and then F, which is sort of the dark red rusty color here. And then we looked at cumulative conditions with the project, and you see there's a small difference between the cumulative without project and cumulative with project. We have a slightly fewer intersections at level service A, more have dropped to level service B. We have fewer intersections at level service D, more have slipped into level service E. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the specific intersections that are going to be mostly affected. So the intersections that I've highlighted with a nice pretty pink circle around them are the ones that would be most affected by this project. And that's because they would either drop to an unacceptable level of service due to the project traffic, or their incremental increase in delay would be considered significant. So there's two intersections here that are unsignalized intersections, one on Marine Parkway at Island Drive, and then one on Redwood Shores Parkway at Bridge Parkway. Both of those would be adversely affected by the project, and our recommendation would be to signalize those intersections. With that signalization, the intersections would operate at an acceptable level. Intersections number 7 and 20. So 7 is at Shoreway Road, Oracle Parkway, and Marine Parkway. And then intersection 20 is Airport Parkway, Shoreway Road, and Holly Street. At those two intersections, we can improve the level of service by changing the signal phasing to allow the southbound right turn to operate at the same time as the eastbound left turn. So with that, that's called an overlap phase. With that change, then those intersections would improve and operate in an acceptable level. The other two intersections that would be affected are within the city of Belmont on Ralston Avenue at El Camino, and then actually, this is not pointing to the right location. It should be the 101 northbound Ramson Island Parkway, Ralston Avenue. So at those intersections, there's no feasible improvements due to right-of-way. And the city of Belmont came to the same conclusion and identified adverse impacts that couldn't be improved when they did their most recent general plan update. Next slide. So our last topic that we covered under transportation is peak spreading. So peak spreading occurs when the traffic has increased to the point where the amount of people who are desiring to travel during the peak periods are exceeding the capacity of the roadway. And then as a result, when the delays become longer and longer, people choose themselves to shift their departure to a non-peak hour. So you might have to leave earlier, you might shift your working hours to avoid the lengthy delays. So that causes the duration of the congestion to increase. So instead of perhaps a 1 hour period, it might be a 2 or 3 or even 4 hour period or longer. So the level of service impacts that I was talking about are focused on the peak hour and the effect on the peak hour, but peak spreading is another effect of the project. Next slide. So these two pretty little graphs show the peak spreading for Marine Parkway. This is the segment of Marine Parkway that is just west of Shoreway Road. This black line represents the capacity, and the little white line down here at the bottom represents the existing traffic on an hour-by-hour basis throughout the day. And you can see it's below the capacity right now because there's quite a bit of vacancy in the area, and also there's still quite a few employees who are working from home. But in the year 2050, the employment is projected to increase, the amount of remote work is projected to decrease. And so now the demand during the peak hour would exceed the capacity. And so we have estimated the effect on peak spreading by taking those trips and shifting them to shoulder hours, and estimated how many additional hours of congestion would occur. And then next slide, we did the same thing for Holly Street, although you can see that in Holly Street, we're only slightly over the capacity, and so the effects of peak spreading are not as great on Holly Street. The next slide has a table that shows the effect. So for Marine Parkway and Holly Street both, right now, as I mentioned, the existing traffic volumes are below capacity, so all of the intersections are operating at acceptable levels. In the year 2050, though, even without the project, just due to the amount of growth that is expected in the region, the hours of congestion on Marine Parkway are expected to be 5 hours in the morning for the eastbound direction and 4 hours in the afternoon for the westbound direction. With the project, the eastbound direction would still experience 5 hours of congestion, but the westbound direction, the length of congestion would increase from 4 to 6 hours. On Holly Street in the future year 2050, the congestion would increase by 1 hour for each direction. So eastbound in the morning would increase from 2 to 3 hours, and westbound in the afternoon would increase from 1 to 2 hours. Next slide. So in summary, for the vehicle miles traveled, we concluded that the project would have a less than significant impact due to the increase in transit use, the change in the land use from what was be permitted under the Westport specific plan, and also the increase in internal trips due to the inclusion of retail and hotel uses. The intersection level service analysis found that 6 of the 20 studied intersections would be adversely affected by the project in the year 2050. And we found improvements were feasible to address those adverse effects at 4 of the 6 intersections. And the peak spreading analysis showed that the project would extend the duration of congestion on the gateways, leading to and from Redwood Shores area by 1 or 2 hours in the year 2050. Next slide. So that is all. You can skip ahead to the utilities slides. I have some additional slides here that we can refer to if needed to answer any of your questions, but I'll hand it over to Leif now to talk about his utilities analysis.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm Leif Kopenen, Vice President and Principal at Schaffenwheeler Consulting Civil Engineers. We are focusing on the city's wet utilities in relation to the precise plan. Next slide. So the purpose of our sensitivity analysis is to look at the range of development intensities in the project area and identify limits of the existing wet utility infrastructure. This analysis is an initial review of information, existing reports and studies, and no detailed computer modeling is done at this point in time. We will do that as we get further on in the process. We looked at the city-owned wet infrastructure, including potable water, recycled water, sanitary sewer, storm drain, and then we also looked at sea level rise considerations. As part of our analysis, we reviewed 3 different levels of development at the site. The existing condition is the first one we looked at, and it assumes office use with the current square footage that's at the site now. And that equates to a lower overall water use than the other alternatives. Next, we looked at no project 2050, assuming an R&D land use type and water use, which is a typically higher water use per square foot of building. And then that is based on build out square footage of the Westport specific plan. And then finally, we looked at the Longfellow Project 2050, which includes the greater square footage of R&D, the addition of a hotel, and amenity spaces. Next slide. So first, we'll talk about the potable water system. And to kind of help with some terminology, when we look at the water system, we will look at 3 things. We look at supply, water supply sufficiency, storage, which is typically housed in water storage tanks, and that is used for peak water demands, helping fight fires, and also providing additional water supply during an emergency. And then lastly, we look at conveyance, which is the pipes underneath the ground that convey the water to each location. So in general terms, the existing system is nearing its capacity now in existing time frame. And then recycled water is available and it is sufficient in its supply to feed the project, and there's already recycled water mains in the area. The project 2050, I will say, we assumed that there will be increase in recycled water for potentially for indoor uses to help mitigate the potable water impacts at the site for the increased development. And then kind of looking at project-specific levels of development, the existing system, again, supply, storage, and conveyance capacity is sufficient. When we move on to No Project 2050, it was identified that additional storage is needed to meet the city's design standards and performance standards. Same with Project 2050, additional storage would be needed. Next slide. Sanitary sewer system, kind of help with some definitions here. We look at, again, three things. We look at gravity sewer pipelines, we look at pump stations, and then we look at the force mains that the pump stations discharge into. And the figure on the right shows kind of the network of pump stations and pipelines. Green is gravity. The maroon color is force mains that are located around Redwood Shores. The site has pump station 25 on site that serves the site. Downstream of that, pump station 12, and then pump station 10 conveys water to the treatment plant in the upper right corner. So system's current capacity is about fully used currently. There are known improvements needed to meet future development, not just specifically this site. And the different levels of development and potential impacts, again, existing conditions, the pump stations, force mains, and pipelines are sufficient. No Project 2050. Some of the pump stations do need capacity improvements. And then if we look at Project 2050, the pump stations, force mains, and some gravity pipelines need capacity improvements. Next slide. For the storm drain system, the city's storm drain system that serves the site has sufficient capacity now. There are no known deficiencies that would impact or be related to the site. In general, the anticipated runoff from the site will be reduced with future development. And that is mostly due to the city's green infrastructure plan, which requires commercial redevelopment and commercial developments to implement LID or low impact design features, including bioretention, infiltration, pervious pavement, and rainwater harvesting as part of their projects. The other component of it is the project plan is looking to reduce impervious surfaces, primarily the surface paved parking lots, in adding green space, which helps reduce stormwater runoff. Again, as Christy mentioned, the project will need to comply with state and county requirements related to site runoff and infiltration overlying the existing landfill. Next slide. We also looked at sea level rise and what the project is proposing. The project is looking at doing a combination of raising existing grades and also raising building elevations. And lastly, looking at including the construction of levees along its frontage to the slough. As part of future planning work, the project's interface with adjacent properties will need to be coordinated, mainly with levee and existing grade, joining properties adjacent to the project. And the project will have to consider future groundwater levels due to sea level rise in their designs for both the buildings and site features. And lastly, again, the project will need to comply with state and county requirements related to the existing landfill, which the last webinar discussed the land's current long-term flood protection plan document that is published for the site as required by the regulatory agencies. And that is it for my slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for those great presentations, and thank you to the participants for all your great questions and comments. We have tried our best to keep track here and answer those that we could. The general comments in or questions in the Q&A function. There's quite a few questions that I hope to get addressed, as many as we can here tonight. And then again, we can follow up, as we always do, with an answer to questions in the summaries that we put together. And all of the questions and comments, as always, are included. So I just want to start, I'll just kind of go maybe in order of the presentations initially, and then we might kind of bounce around to address as many of these questions as we can. Some are kind of overlapping, so some questions are very similar. But Christy, I'm going to start with a question to you. Leanna asks or notes that the noise that will carry to the Blair Island over 25 years will have a severe impact to that protected site. And she was curious what agency will have to approve this.
So I think the question is about the natural area reference as Bear Island near the project
Bear,
site.
I'm sorry, that's right.
That's
yeah.
okay. It's like
I said
an
Blair.
animal bear. Yeah. So the noise analysis in the SQL document will look at to evaluate whether there are substantial increases in ambient noise levels, and so that would include adjacent uses. And as, let's say, if we're primarily focused on the adjacent residential use, if the noise increase is not considered substantial there, just the noise impacts are even less as you move out from the site. So that it's a really good question. We'll be looking at that, but it's really the city that will have the approval authority for whether or not this project moves forward.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I'm going to actually, now that I have you on the screen, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions and then we'll move on to the others. Jennifer asked if you could please elaborate on the potential causes of hazardous material impacts related to the project, distinguishing between the construction and operations.
Yes, sure, Jennifer. So I think the way you broke it out is how it's going to be done eventually in the EIR, where we first evaluate hazardous materials impacts from construction, which would include, demolition of the building, removing of, and that would evaluate potential impacts from disturbing the underlying landfill as well. So that would be looked at for construction. So the examples of construction hazardous materials could include possible asbestos or lead-based paint that would be in the existing buildings that would be demoed and removed. So that's one example, and transporting that appropriately off-site to a disposal facility. For operational hazardous materials impacts, it could include any regular transport, use, or disposal or generation of hazardous materials from like the life science use on site. So that would be evaluated in the operational portion of the hazardous materials section.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Let's see. I think that's it. There's a few other just general comments that we can come back to. I'm not sure if it's directly a question. There's one more actually, now that I have you on the screen, is Roger notes that the pile driving impact in a liquefied area is huge. Is there a way to minimize this vibration causing structural damage to the structures nearby?
That I don't have the answer right now, Roger. So that will be evaluated in the EIR. It's a really good question, and it's a concern that would be addressed in the CEQA document.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Let's see, moving on down the list here. Michelle, we'll go to you next. Just kind of, again, order of presentations, and then we kind of loop back to others. Leanne notes that the traffic analysis report shows traffic will be doubled in wait, I'm sorry, let me read that again. The traffic analysis report shows traffic will be double the population of Redwood Shores. And she is wondering how that could possibly be mitigated.
So we did look at opportunities for improvement for intersections that would be impacted by the project. And that's why I mentioned some of the improvements at specific intersections. But beyond that, the project would be required to comply with the city's TDM program. TDM stands for Transportation Demand Management. And those are measures that developments need to implement to reduce the number of trips. So things that would encourage carpool or encourage employees to bike or to take transit, to take shuttles, and so forth. So those measures will all be used to the extent possible. But our analysis is identifying, what is possible and what is the effect with and without that.
Great, thank you, Michelle. One maybe somewhat related question is the presentation shows that regional growth will have a significant adverse impact. And the question is, the project will have a severe impact on traffic. CEQA requires mitigation. This comment is that the city has to substantiate why it can approve an impact that can't be mitigated. So the question is, how would the city justify approving the project given mitigation of the traffic flooding into the nearby streets cannot be mitigated? And that's a long-winded question for you, but hopefully that all made sense. And Christy, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, I think that this isn't so much a question about traffic, the technical aspects of traffic as a CEQA legal question. So I don't think I'm probably the best person to answer this question. And it seems that it also is more related to sort of past actions that the city has taken potentially as far as the Westport specific plan. But and also even related to the land use projections that were provided to us. So we sort of just take the data that's given to us and say, okay, with these number of jobs, this is the the world you're going to be living in as far as traffic. But the justification for those numbers is sort of beyond our area of expertise.
I think I could add on to Michelle's response just about, just in general, if there is a significant unavoidable impact, whether it be traffic or another environmental resource area, the city has to make findings and adopt a statement of overriding considerations that documents why the benefits of a project outweigh the significant environmental impacts. So that's what needs to take place in order for the city to move forward and approve a project that has significant unavoidable environmental impacts under CEQA.
Great, thank you both. And I think this question is probably addressed at both of you as well, maybe more so Christy, but what are the potential impacts, or Stephen asked, what are the potential impacts related to the construction and use of a new road, Longfellow Lane, moved much closer to the southern neighborhoods than current traffic patterns, such as increased noise, air pollution, and visual impacts to nearby residents. And a second part of that is what impacts on neighborhoods are expected from the 2 new large parking garages with exits aimed south at the residential areas. I know that's a lot to chew on.
I think the majority of those concerns are not transportation related. Air and noise, I'll let Christy speak to those, but the sensitivity analysis was a limited analysis. When we do the full transportation analysis for CEQA, we'll also be doing some other additional operational analysis looking at the project's access, and we'll be looking at the specific locations of where the parking would be provided and how that would those access points would operate, and looking at the operation of those intersections in terms of delay and queuing, and then that information would be fed to Christy and the air and noise consultants to for use in evaluating the impacts. So is there anything more you need to add, Christy?
No, I think you got it, Michelle. So if a roadway was moved, Longfellow Way, right, we move further south, closer to the existing residents and traffic were to go there, we would be evaluating the traffic generated noise effects of that and whether it be substantially increasing the ambient noise at the nearby residents. And then I think the commenter hit on the other resource areas that would come into play with development of the site, including aesthetic impacts and the air pollution. So for operational impacts, we'll be talking about project generated traffic and whether the emissions from those vehicles traveling along those roadways would result in significant health or environmental impacts. So that will definitely be evaluated in the document.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Eric Kirkovich, Ramian Associates. Thanks for all the terrific questions tonight. This is going to be one of the topics that will be of interest and focus during the discussions on the project alternatives coming up on February the 12th. This is one of the specific urban design strategies that we look at as part of the alternatives and shifting the location and access to those structures. So stay tuned for that, and we're excited to share that information with you all and get your feedback on those urban design ideas.
Great, thank you all. I just wanted to quick time check here. We have about 8 minutes left. I anticipate we might go a bit over. We've received now about 51 questions, of which I think some we've answered in the Q&A. Others, there's just general comments that have been posted that, again, all of this will be transcribed as part of the summary, and a transcription will also be included alongside that. I wanted to jump, and I'll come back to a couple other comments that were made, but one other question related to traffic, I believe, that then we'll cover, and then there's a couple questions for you as well, Leif. So let's see if I can get through all this question. So there's a big lead into this. Maybe I'll just go ahead and read it. It says 2050 cumulative LOS impacts are still 25 years out and reflect hypothetical regional growth. Even so, it would be helpful to see how quickly we expect to reach the ratings shown for 2050. And the question is, are you able to depict the LOS changes over time for the different scenarios? And at which point along the timeline, now until 2050, do the ratings start to degrade? And just the last part of that is, what project impacts independent of the projected regional growth produce measurable degradation in ratings? Oof, that was a mouthful. Okay. Over to you, Michelle.
Okay, so I have, I think, a good answer for this. The CEQA analysis will include an additional scenario, which will be existing plus project, that won't include the cumulative growth. So the only difference will be the addition of the project itself. So I think that was one of the commenters request was for looking at, how can we see how the project would affect the area even without the other regional growth. As far as the timing of the regional growth and at how quickly you might be experiencing poor levels of service, I think that is not a question that I'm expecting to answer because we're not looking at any other interim scenarios. Those are related more to economic conditions and, when the area, just the economy of the area, how quickly, jobs are produced. That is not going to be part of our traffic analysis, but we will be looking at the existing plus project. So that will give you a clear view of that.
Great, thank you. And I love to see you all kind of answering each other's questions within the Q&A as well, which is really helpful because you all live and experience the community and are the experts. So I appreciate that happening. Leif, I think one of your questions might have already been answered by the team. So I'm just going to ask a couple more CEQA related questions and then come back to that. So Christy, Stephen asked, why isn't there more attention given to other infrastructure? Actually, Leif, this could be for you as well, such as energy or waste management.
Leif doesn't do energy or waste
That's true.
management.
That's true. Just water, just utilities. We'll leave it.
Yeah, there is going to be a separate section in the environmental analysis for energy. And like Troy mentioned, this is just the beginning of our analysis and research. So be assured that energy will be looked at in addition to wet utilities. Let's see, what the electricity is also infrastructure is going to be looked at, as well as what the commenter mentioned, the solid waste facilities in the area and whether or not they'd have sufficient capacity to receive the solid waste generated by the project. So those are two resources that will be evaluated in the EIR more thoroughly and in depth than what's presented in the sensitivity analysis.
Great, thank you for that. Actually, along maybe similar measures or related to the CEQA is how will impact of glass and light on bird species be studied and addressed? The question from Chris.
Yes, so in terms of the Longfellow development project, our biologists will look at the site plan as well as the materials that are being proposed on the facade of the building and compare it to standard bird safety design guidelines and determine whether or not any changes or mitigation would be needed to reduce impacts to bird collisions.
Great, and somewhat related, it's Geeta notes that some buildings are shown much closer to the shoreline, and she was wondering how this impacts the shading of the wetlands.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So, Geeta, that's a good question, and our biologists will be looking at that when we do our more project-specific impact analysis for the CEQA document.
Excellent. Maybe I'm not sure if you'll have an answer for this one, Michelle, but there's a question about how many people bike into the neighborhood of the Redwood Shores from places like the San Carlos station.
Yeah, I don't have that information. But we did the baseline of our analysis is based on existing traffic counts, so it would reflect the level of people using bike facilities or transit facilities, and I recognize they are limited in this area. So the existing counts would reflect that fact to the extent that people are biking or taking transit. It's reflected in the counts. And then our future modeling reflects those facilities, as they exist.
Great, thank you. Let me see. I'm gonna ask the team that's helping me track questions if there's anything that I've missed that we should cover. There's quite a few just general comments that, again, we'll make sure are part of the transcript. You all that are in the meeting with us right now could see them and track them, but we'll also include them in the overall summary as a transcript. But I think I believe we've answered questions either through the Q&A or noted here. Is there anything I'm missing, team? Well, I see one other. Oh, yes, go ahead, Michelle.
I noticed there was one comment about how when I talked about the no project scenario, I talked about the office use that's permitted under the Westport specific plan. And I think Leif in his utility analysis talked about that scenario as being an R&D use. And the Westport specific plan allows either office or R&D, which is similar to life science use. And from a traffic standpoint, the office use is a worst case scenario, would generate the most trips because employees, there's more employees per square foot for office uses than for R&D or life science uses. So for us, that is the worst case. I think for Leif, it's a different conclusion. So it's not that we're not talking to each other, it's that we're both trying to be conservative and reflect what is the maximum use that is permitted under the Westport specific plan. But that what is the maximum case differs depending upon the subject area that we're talking about.
Yeah, so for us, R&D, we anticipate more water use per square foot. So we don't track employee count, but we look at the actual office usage, and R&D uses more water, generates more wastewater. And that's why we use that as worst case, just like Michelle said. So we were trying to look at worst case for no project 2050. And we actually did talk about this. So
yeah, that's right. It's come up.
It is confusing, but we are trying to look at worst case.
Sure, I don't know if there's also a question, just a general one, considering the congestion increase is huge, why there aren't any infrastructure or road infrastructure improvements?
Well, I mean, we did identify some improvements to the roads, but you know, the right of way is limited. So that is the main constraint, and the biggest issues as far as, you know, the capacity are, you know, the intersections closest to 101, there isn't any additional right-of-way available to really expand and provide to increase the capacity other than just by changing the signal phasing. In order to do that, we have to eliminate U-turns at those locations, though. That's a reasonable trade-off because there is not any big demand for U-turns at that location. There isn't any driveways or any properties that are requiring a U-turn at that location. So it's feasible to eliminate the U-turns, but the right-of-way constraints in an area that's mostly developed are the primary consideration.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions here. And then again, I just want to value everyone's time here. And I will definitely, we're taking all these questions in. We're going to look through this all again and respond to all of the questions as part of the summary. But Leif, this might be a question for you from Steve, is give maybe the water component, but given the planned biolabs use of the site, are there any considerations for specialized infrastructure or safety, considering that biolabs consume huge amounts of plastics as well as fresh water and energy?
Yeah, so as water related infrastructure, there are protections for the public water system with backflow preventers to make sure, and if it's very severe with on-site materials or chemicals, or even can be air gapping. So it protects the public water system from any backfeed. And then with the sewer system, a lot of times these sites they have to sample their waste stream, and that's a requirement from the wastewater treatment plant to make sure that they can treat and handle the effluent from the site. And those are all kind of existing requirements that any developer or any landowner would have to, commercial landowner would have to comply with.
For that bit of the question about the recycling the plastic, so when we'll for the utility section in the EIR, in addition to the utilities waste analyzing, we'll talk about just solid waste generation and recycling services available currently. And we'll be estimating how much the proposed use would generate and whether the receiving facilities, whether it be the landfill or the materials processing facility, has existing capacity to accommodate the demand by the project. So that will be looked at.
Great, thank you both so much. And I see some of these questions also possibly related to a life sciences webinar we have planned coming up on February 6th, I believe. So we can kind of refer to some of those questions and hopefully get those answers there as well. Let's see. I'm seeing again a lot of questions. There's questions about transit that you all answered internally, which is fantastic. I'm going to ask the team one more time here if there's anything that I am missing that we haven't either answered in the Q&A and or through verbally and or we'll answer after we have time to kind of think through the question and provide an answer. And I'm not seeing anyone raising their hand. So Troy, I'm going to ask you to bring the presentation back up and remind folks of next steps in the process before we wrap up.
Great, thanks, Dave. And as we discussed a little bit previously, really the biggest next step is to determine and confirm that refined project alternative. As Eric mentioned, we'll be holding a workshop on February 12th. We'll be presenting, the team will be presenting some options that we've come up with for some moves in terms of the site layout, the site configuration. We'll be taking your feedback there, and we'll be running a survey, and then we'll be refining that. Once we have that alternative kind of locked in, that will kick off Christy and David J. Powers' full CEQA analysis. That will be full in-depth analysis for the project, the no project, and the alternative. There'll be mitigation measures, additional studies. Michelle will work on additional traffic impacts such as queuing, bicycle pedestrian, transit, and Leif will commence even further community modeling for his utilities impact study. As I mentioned before, that will also be paralleled by some economic analysis. We'll be developing cost estimates for any needed transportation utility improvements that will feed into a fiscal impacts analysis, as well as a community benefits analysis. And we plan on holding a community workshop on the community benefits topic later this year. Finally, there will be the development of the precise plan as we move forward with policies and figures and standards that will regulate any development on the site. And finally, just as a reminder, Dave mentioned our next event is another webinar really focused on life sciences and the safety of those uses on the site. That will be next week, February the 6th. We'll have the workshop February 12th at the library, an online survey to accompany that, and then finally a presentation and discussion and a public meeting at March 4th with the City Council and a joint meeting with the PC as well. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close the webinar today. Dave, anything else?
No, that's it. I just, again, wanted to thank the panel for their great presentations and thank you all for all the participants for all your great comments and questions. And we hope to see you on February 6th, and we'll be actively working on the summary for this meeting as well as all of the meetings in this series, and we'll be posting that to the website along with the videos and the presentation, so keep an eye out for that. So thank you all again, and have a great evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.